Okay, so we'll begin the presentation now, beginning with Sheila. Sheila Jeffreys, I will hand it over to you.
I've called this talk the Pornography Revolution because I want to look at pornography not as a discrete problem, but as a defining force that has transformed the lives of women and children in the last 4 decades. This cultural revolution has come to influence or construct more and more areas of the lives of women and girls. And just to give you an idea of how likely pornography is to be very influential, it's good to have some recent figures on how many men and boys actually look at it. And in 2022, there were official government figures put out, which suggested that 25% of men under 30 in the UK watch pornography every day or most days. The figures for women, not just under 30, but of any women of any age, are less than 2% of women watch pornography in that way. So when feminists have researched and campaigned against porn, we have always emphasized that the most direct harm is what it does to the women it uses, because it's a form of prostitution, filmed prostitution, and it causes the same psychological and physical damage that other forms of the sex industry do, such as PTSD, venereal disease and lost fertility, head injuries, vaginal and anal tears, rape, being beaten up, and so on. So I'm not going to talk about that today. Today, I want to talk about some of the wider harms to women and girls and our status that pornography has created. It has, I argue, transformed how men treat women sexually and in general in public life. It has transformed sexual practice. Young women, for instance, must now suffer anal sex and strangulation. It has transformed fashion and beauty practices. Women must wear crippling shoes called slut pumps as a result of their origin in the industry. It has transformed the way boy children, even in primary school, treat girls and their female teachers. There are few areas of everyday life in which porn has not constructed a world in many ways very different from the 1970s, when the industry began and when feminists like myself started to campaign against it. I formed with other radical feminists the first anti-pornography group in Britain in 1977. Pornography is now fundamental to the culture of male domination. I define pornography, as Kathleen Barry did in Female Sexual Slavery in 1984, as the propaganda of woman hatred. And there's nothing equal opportunity about pornography. It's a conversation between men, constructed out of the turning of women into objects for sexual use. Women do not have equal status to men in porn. The men in porn do not suffer routine humiliation and violence for women's sexual excitement. It is entirely the other way around. Now, it is particularly effective as propaganda because, of course, it leads to orgasm, which is very, very powerful for men in bringing men back again and again to the source of their excitement. And it obviously reinforces the messages of porn very strongly. So as propaganda which constantly reruns the degradation of women and our reduction to less than human status, it is to be expected that it will affect men's views of women and behavior towards us in everything: teaching, fashion, advertising, music, film, and the appearance of women in public life. I shall argue today that this is exactly what it does. When feminists like me first began to campaign against porn, we were constantly told that there was no proof that it had any effect on the way men thought and acted towards women. And one of our responses often was to say that this was never said about texts like the Bible, for instance. It was always assumed that time spent reading the Bible was educative and salutary and would change behavior. This is assumed about many forms of literature, in fact. It's only in relation to porn that it is argued that it is irrelevant to human behavior. Rather than having no effect, I argue that as the industry has expanded, the social respect for and political status of women has been reduced with devastating consequences. There is no industry run by women for women in which men are turned into despicable objects for use and torture. Porn originates in women's degraded and less than human status, and it is not imaginable in a world in which women have their liberation. Some may be tempted to say, but there was always pornography in some form. But it's not really so. Back in the 1960s, when I entered a few brief years of a sexual life with men before I became a lesbian, there was no porn as there is now. There were porn magazines like Playboy and Penthouse for sale in corner shops, and doubtless some young men did buy them, but there were still only photos in them, and women were not being beaten and tortured. The young men I knew did not show any acquaintance with pornography magazines, and indeed, I studied sex instruction books with them, which contained diagrams of female genitals. What a different world, since now sex education consists of online porn videos, and the clitoris, which existed in late 60s sex education books, is no longer to be seen. By the late 1970s, there was already considerable development in the industry. In the magazines, there were now full-page spreads of women's genitals, called in the trade salmon sandwich or split beaver. There were porn videos available from sex shops that could be viewed at home with video recorders. Films such as Deep Throat were porn movies on general release. Then in 1977, I saw boy children looking at a full-page spread of women's genitals in a porn magazine in a corner shop, and I was very disturbed. As a result, the London Revolutionary Feminist Anti-Pornography Consciousness-Raising Group was formed, first such group in the UK. The issue was new and newsworthy. We got on the evening news, protesting outside corner shops that sold porn. We petitioned the Greater London Council, whose underground trains carried ads for sexually violent films, and we got them removed. We would not be newsworthy now. In 1980, we formed Women Against Violence Against Women, campaigning against sexually violent films and other forms of porn. For several years, we thrived, and there were more than 40 other WAVOR groups around the country. Now, though, porn is ubiquitous, and there is almost no mention of feminist agitation against it. Opposition may seem futile and unimaginable. In the 1980s and 1990s, the porn industry developed exponentially. There was a great leap forward when the industry went online. There was no longer a source of sexual entertainment that a boy or man would have to seek out in magazine form at a sex shop, something very few did, and to which there was a stigma attached. Porn had become a cultural force that was influencing fashion, sexual practice, the music industry. Women and girls were being sexualized and turned out as sexual entertainment for men on the catwalk as female singers and so on. Porn had begun to seriously change the conditions of everyday life for women. Porn had become the overwhelming form of sex education, and the line between the sex industry and non-commercial encounters between men and women had become thin. As an example of where we are at now, I'd like to mention the porn advertisement, which was put out by two campaign groups who were supporting the Democrats in the recent election. A newspaper report described it thus: it shows a fictitious Republican legislator enter a man's bedroom as he's watching porn and take away his cell phone. As the young man protests, the fictitious lawmaker adds, "I won the last election, so it's my decision. I'm just going to watch and make sure you don't finish illegally." I presume that's a reference to masturbation. I'm not always very familiar with the language men use amongst themselves. Now, the campaigners of a political party appealing so blatantly to one sex at the expense of the other would once, I suspect, have been seen as risky. Not anymore. Because porn is seen as this naked appeal to male citizens over the bodies of women. That naked appeal now seems normal now. So I want to go into looking at some of the areas in detail that pornography has an influence on, and I'll start with pornography and fashion. One of the first areas of women's lives to be dramatically affected by the porn industry was fashion. In the early 2000s, I became very disturbed at the extent to which fashion had developed to sexualize women to resemble the way women were portrayed in pornography. I still remember the 1970s, when fashion for women was affected by the women's liberation movement. The high-heeled winkle-picker shoes of the 1950s and 60s went out of fashion. Women wore small heels, if they wore heels at all, with room for their toes. This is clear if you look at the movies from that time, which are very educational. Fashion was, for a brief period, slightly more egalitarian, though women's clothing still revealed much of their bodies for men's sexual excitements with short skirts and so on. Feminists, of course, rejected makeup entirely in the UK in the 1970s and 80s, rejected short skirts and generally skirts in favor of jeans and t-shirts. There was generally a greater freedom of women's appearance in the late 20th century. In the 1980s, when what was called power dressing came in for women, there were shoulder pads, and it represented women's supposed move into the corporate world. So fashion has been different. Then in the early 2000s, I realized that something had changed dramatically. I was seeing winkle-picker, very high-heeled shoes back in fashion in a very extreme form. I saw more than once ordinary women trying to walk down the street in these shoes and falling flat, so they had to be helped up. The return of crippling and degrading shoes for women, and I argue, was related to the dramatic rise of the sex industry, and particularly pornography, and the merging of all its symbols and practices into fashion. From the 1980s onwards, gay male fashion designers introduced more and more references to porn and men's fetishistic sexuality into fashion. And this started with an obsession with sadomasochism. Fashion contained black leather and straps and studs. If you remember Madonna, some of you will be old enough to remember that. Fashion designers are overwhelmingly men, and they clothe women in ways that give them sexual excitement, despise the ways in which they harm women and women's status, or perhaps because of it. Most of those men are gay. They do not have to walk or appear in public in shoes they may fall over in, but they do put women in those shoes. Some of these gay designers can be found online wearing the crippling shoes for their own sexual excitement, but not usually into the supermarket. In pornography, the women wear absurd and crippling shoes as a matter of course. Often they wear nothing else, just the shoes, which are transparent plastic strips on extremely high heels. In porn, these are called slut pumps. These slut pumps are the footwear that the gay male fashion designers have put onto women in the 21st century. So they've come out of the pornography and onto women. The effect that such shoes have on women is to make them vulnerable and alter their posture to thrust out breast and buttocks, and that's sexually exciting to men. And it's very well described in the shoe fetishist literature, and there is plenty of that. The famous French gay male shoe designer Christian Louboutin was asked in 2013 to explain what men find attractive about a woman in high heels. And as reported in a fashion magazine at the time, he said it was the fact that the heels slowed the woman down, giving the man more time to look at her. Louboutin said nothing about aesthetics, only speed. What is the point of wanting to run, he said. I am all for the pace getting slower, and high heels are very good for that. So this is a gay man explaining why he designs those shoes and puts them on women. It slows them down. Another way in which porn helps to prescribe the kinds of tortures that women must inflict upon their bodies is in the normalizing of the shaving of women's vulvas, a practice men say they like because it makes women clean and shows their genitals clearly to the male gaze. All the practices that have gradually become necessary for women in pornography and other forms of prostitution have become normalized for women who are not in prostitution, such as breast implants and anal bleaching. in which women have to make their anuses look attractive to men in case they wish to use that particular orifice. More and more degrading, painful practices have become necessary so that women may service their porn-trained masters. I want to talk a little bit now about sexual practice. Another result of the porn revolution is that porn now constructs everyday sexual practice. There's a great deal of research by feminist academics that makes it clear that boys and men who use porns develop more sexually aggressive attitudes towards women. But rather than look at rape and other more extreme forms of sexual violence today, I want to look at the result of pornography now being sex education on everyday heterosexual sex, which has now become something routinely degrading, painful, and destructive to women's health and even to their lives. Back in the 1970s, feminists in the women's liberation movement campaigned for women's right to define their own sexuality. Imagine that, when now, of course, pornography is sex education. We saw that as absolutely crucial. And now it seems ludicrous, really, because porn teaches violent male sexuality as normal and just what sex is. Anal sex, for instance, was not usual in heterosexual sex in the Anglosphere in the 1960s and 70s. It is very common now, though, and it's usually painful for women and certainly offers no pleasure. It is, though, a practice which gives men the pleasure of a tight tube, which they like, and of being able to degrade women, which is the stuff of pornography and is exciting to men. A UK 2022 study found that women are suffering injuries and other health problems as a result of the growing popularity of anal sex among straight couples. The consequences include, for women, incontinence, sexually transmitted infections, as well as pain and bleeding, because the women experience bodily trauma while engaging in the practice. The National Survey of Sexual Attitudes research, which was undertaken in Britain, found that the proportion of 16 to 24-year-olds engaging in heterosexual anal intercourse has risen from 12.5% to 28.5% over recent decades. Similarly, in the US, 30 to 45% of both sexes have experienced it. And this is generally seen by these researchers as being connected with increased use of pornography. However, women who engage in anal sex are at greater risk from it than men. The research says increased rates of fecal incontinence and anal sphincter injury have been reported in women. Women are at a higher risk of incontinence than men because of their different anatomy and the effects of hormones, pregnancy, and childbirth on the pelvic floor. It explains that women have less robust anal sphincters and lower anal canal pressures than men, and damage caused by anal penetration is therefore more consequential. But this is now recommended in sort of magazines for young people and seen as pretty normal. What would once have been seen as the violent practices of sadomasochism have been normalized, such as strangulation, which excites the man and can result in death or permanent brain damage to the woman. July this year, Australian researchers published a study showing that among 18 to 25-year-olds, over half of the more than 4,700 surveyed had choked or been choked by a sexual partner. Among young people, sexual choking has become mainstream. The main way that young people were introduced to it was through pornography. In previous decades, everyday sex would not have been assumed to involve the risk of serious brain injury. But now, as a result of the porn revolution, it does. The strangulation cuts off blood flow and causes serious brain injury, if not death. I just want to mention the way in which pornography has created fetishism, although I know you've heard me speak about this many times before, I suspect. Men's fetishistic sexual practices are increasingly common and emerging into popular culture as a result of their promotion in porn. One of these, and the one that women and girls are particularly suffering from right now in very many ways, is transvestism. 50 years ago, the first transvestite magazine for men, Transvestia, began to be published in the US. It was supposedly to offer support and did not include specifically sexual material. In 2016, and that's the most recent figure I have today, I'm afraid, 10% of the online porn on Pornhub was specifically for these men. On Amazon, there are very many constantly renewed novels about men being transgendered by women and subjected to deliciously exciting humiliations, such as having lipstick forced on them or being required to do filing in an office in a short skirt, that sort of secretary transvestite porn. There's pregnancy porn, in which men pretend to be pregnant, breastfeeding porn, in which Thai ladyboys, for instance, have to ingest substances that will enable them to exude liquid when being used in prostitution. There's age regression porn, which is all about men becoming female, but as female babies, having their nappies changed, or as schoolgirls. Transvestite porn is so common now that it is studied, and editions of academic journals are dedicated to articles about it. There's a variety of online porn called Sissy Hypno, which trains men to gain sexual excitement by pretending to be women. It hypnotizes them into doing so, and men online talk about how this has turned them into women. So there's no ambiguity there about the influence of porn on creating this serious harm to women. But there are specialized varieties of porn which cater for all the different fetishes men are capable of developing, all of which are harmful to women and girls. There's porn for furries and for plushophiles, for feeders, for men interested in having their limbs amputated and for pretending to be disabled in a variety of ways. Some men want to have their backs broken or may just want to use wheelchairs. In the 1960s and 70s, it is likely that these interests would have been much less common because simply not known about and promoted as sexually exciting. As the porn industry seeks to create a greater variety of niches, we can expect to see more and more perverse forms of male sexuality become normalized, and that is exactly what is happening. So I want to go on to look at what effect pornography is happening on boy children. As the industry has developed, it's been increasingly accessed by children, particularly boy children. In 2005 research, it showed that 95% of the children who accessed porn online were boys. I'm sure that figure is very similar. Though it is still mainly boys who use it, more girls are being drawn in though, and learning that their sexual role is to be used as sexual objects in whatever way boys and men desire. A 2021 article explains that gone are the baby boomers' days of hiding pilfered Playboy magazines under the bed. Today's teenagers are merely a few clicks away from seemingly infinite streaming pornography. The children report that porn is their sex education. So school systems in many countries are introducing what is called pornography literacy to their sex education programs. This acknowledges that porn may give some misinformation about sexual practice, but accepts that children will use it and need to recognize what is good and bad about it. This is a new world of sex education in which girls have no choice to learn that there is a view of sex more suited to their autonomy and pleasure. There is evidence that the boys are becoming particularly advanced in woman hating. This is the violence and sexual violence that boys at both primary and secondary schools are exhibiting towards both girls and women teachers. One of the findings of a study that's recently been done in Australia on this violence is that there is a heightened use of misogynistic language and behaviors by male students, some as young as 5. Researchers found a heightened use of vulgar, sexualized, and aggressive language being used primarily by boys and young men during their interaction with women and girls. Boys were using terms such as slut and describing women as rapeable. They also reported male students making animal noises, meowing or barking, or making offensive gestures, grabbing their genitals and making other rude gestures at girls and women in the school. One primary school teacher described how several students in her Year 1 class have been making sex sounds to herself, a co-teacher, and other students. A primary school teacher said that the boys do it so often that they do it without intention or thought now. Now, where would they have found out what a sex sound was? Boys were found to be working in groups to physically intimidate their female teachers and peers. This includes corralling girls and women into corners out of sight of male staff. As one high school teacher told the researchers, male students will walk quickly behind female teachers to rush them downstairs. In the case of one of the boys who had been making sex sounds at a teacher, it was found that he had been watching his brother's porn videos online, and I'm sure that is the case very generally. The researchers here and in other research now being published on this problem tend to attribute it to the misogynist, pimp, rapist, influencer Andrew Tate, but we have to ask where Andrew Tate came from. He is, after all, a pimp and thoroughly involved with the sex industry. Before there were male influencers like Andrew Tate, there was a porn revolution, which made this vicious sexual exploitation of women and its promotion unremarkable. Porn runs through all of this violence, but it is easier to focus on one man as the cause, although much of the research mentions pornography, of course. Another way in which I see pornography as affecting women's status is in attacks on female politicians. I've spoken before on pornography and the deleterious effect it has on democracy, so I won't spend too much time on it here. We will probably agree that women's equal participation in the democratic process is a necessary feature of democracy. Women have fought for more than a century all over the world to get women the vote and the right to stand as representatives. But today, as a result of the convenience of social media, and I suggest the sophisticated woman-hating being nurtured through porn and other areas of the sex industry, women MPs are receiving so much mainly sexualized abuse and threats on email that some consider quitting and some women think they could not bear to stand. There is nothing egalitarian about these rape and death threats. Men do not receive anything like this abuse and do not receive sexual threats in the same way. And Black and ethnic minority women receive far and away the most. There is a whole area of study in political science based on what is called civility in politics, and general agreement among political scientists that civility is a vital component of a working democracy. But it is seldom suggested what might be destroying this civility. I suggest that the vicious hatred of women that is peddled by the porn industry is a way to explain this very serious destruction of respect for women politicians that is taking place. And probably many of you, like me, will be extremely aware that there has been a lack of civility in the election in America. I mean, it's simply not possible for women to have any kind of equality or standing in politics or elections that take place with vicious sexual insults and hatred of women, which has been so normalized it's possible for a president of the United States to be elected simply through this foul-mouthed woman-hating. Now, something has got us there, and I do think that we need to understand that part of that is pornography, and it's a very, very serious situation that we are in right now. So, in conclusion today, the question is how we can bring back feminist campaigns against pornography at a time when porn has been so completely normalized. Instead of in any way seeking to eliminate this misogyny, politicians will protect it or even use it to gain votes. Remember the Democrat porn and masturbation ad? How do we turn this around and make the completely normalized unacceptable as it would have been, at least in the dirty raincoat days of the 1960s, when I started my sexual life? So that's it for now, sisters. Thank you for listening.